Aloha. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you for joining us for Pacific Forum's Comparative Connections Roundtable. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at Pacific Forum, editor of Comparative Connections, a triannual e-journal of bilateral relations in the Indo-Pacific, and your MC for this program. For those of you who are not familiar with the publication, Comparative Connections is published 3 times a year, providing timely analysis on key bilateral relationships across the Indo-Pacific region. Every issue is made up of 12 regular chapters, plus 1 rotating chapter appearing once yearly, each authored by recognized specialists who review critical developments within a given relationship and assess their implications for regional security, US interests, and the future of the region as a whole. Our regional overview chapter provides even greater insights into the policy trends, multilateral dynamics, and emerging challenges of this increasingly interconnected and increasingly complex region. Each chapter also includes a carefully curated chronology section that synthesizes the day-to-day policy developments, diplomatic engagements, and bilateral exchanges that outline the trajectory of each relationship. These chapter chronologies contribute to a running sortable chronology section that can be traced all the way back to the first issue of Comparative Connections in 1999. In addition to these analytical chapters and bilateral chronologies, the Comparative Connections website hosts 2 databases: a state visits database dedicated to tracking official visits by heads of state, and our multilateral forums database, which similarly tracks the occurrence of select high-level meetings. The various components of this site complement one another and provide users with a holistic understanding of each bilateral relationship's rich history, contemporary successes and challenges, as well as future areas of cooperation. The various components of the site complement one another to provide users with all this. A link to view our most recent issue of Comparative Connections can be found in the chat box now. Today, we are joined by our US Southeast Asia chapter, Dr. Catherine Dalpino, and the authors of our China Southeast Asia chapter, Dr. Robert Sutter and Dr. Chin-Hao Huang. Dr. Catherine Dalpino is Professor Emeritus at Georgetown University and former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, US Department of State. Dr. Robert Sutter is Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University, who has published 21 books, the most recent of which is US-China Relations, Perilous Past, Uncertain Present in 2018. Dr. Chin-Hao Huang is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale and US College in Singapore. His publications have appeared in the China Quarterly, the China Journal, International Peacekeeping, and in edited volumes through Oxford University Press and Routledge, among others. I want to thank each of our distinguished panelists for being here today. We look forward to your remarks and for the fruitful discussion that will surely follow. After our panelist presentation, we will transition to a brief Q&A segment where we will welcome feedback and questions from our audience. I would like to now give the floor over to our moderator, Ralph Cossa, President Emeritus at Pacific Forum and WSD Honda Chair in Peace Studies, to kick off today's program. Ralph?
Thank you, Rob. Aloha, everyone. Delighted to have you all with us, and a real pleasure to be here with so many good friends and noted scholars. We will go right into the presentations. I've asked each speaker to try to limit their remarks to 10 to 12 minutes. We'll then open it up for Q&A. Several of you have already sent in questions, and I will deal with those first as the sort of reward for your good planning. And then we will watch the chat room or the raised hand function for those who want to interact with the 3 speakers. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I know, Chin, you're first, so you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Ralph. And thanks to Rob and the Pacific Forum staff for organizing this timely event. Let me just first begin by saying that if my presentation is any at all bit coherent or informative, I really have to attribute that to 2 great mentors and colleagues sitting here in the discussion panel with me, Bob Sutter and Catherine Dalpino. Both taught me very well at Georgetown University. And likewise, if I'm incoherent, I also have them too. They share part of the blame as well. It's early here, 8 a.m. in Singapore. It's great to be with everybody. I've been asked to share a few comments specifically on ASEAN views and ASEAN approaches. I'll keep it primarily on the Myanmar crisis, but I'd be happy to broaden that to other topics in Southeast Asia, security issues beyond Myanmar during the Q&A, if that's of interest to the audience. So on ASEAN views and approaches to Myanmar, what's happened? I'll just run down a quick chronology of events and then share some assessment of why I think that's the approach or the tack that ASEAN has taken so far. We know that in February, unfortunately, there was some backsliding and democratization in Myanmar, and we saw that on February 1st, the military junta took over and a coup was effectively established. It took about 2 months, unfortunately, before ASEAN rallied together, and in April, we saw that there was an emergency session calling in as many of the heads of states and leaders in the region, in ASEAN 10, to come together to Indonesia to convene a session that would address the specific issue of the humanitarian outfall and what's going on in Myanmar. Myanmar was invited, and so it was a full 10 member attendance. And in that meeting, there was a quite frank and open discussion about what's been happening. And all 10 members were sharing their concerns and their frustration to what's been going on in Myanmar. Out of that emergency session came a statement as well as a 5-point consensus that I think we're all very aware. I won't belabor the details of it, but the chief among which the key details that came out of that summit was an agreement that there was going to be a cessation of hostilities, that the sort of bloodshed and the violence is unacceptable. And there was also this insistence that a dialogue amongst the key actors in Myanmar is important, and that any sort of resumption of dialogue needs to be expedited in Myanmar for the process to move forward. There's also, importantly, an outcome, a decision that ASEAN would appoint an envoy to visit Myanmar at the earliest date possible. And so that was another sort of key outcome that came out of this session in April. The envoy would obviously serve as a bridge between the ASEAN 9 and what's going on in Myanmar and the junta leaders. And also the envoy would be expected to monitor progress, specifically on the time frame that the junta has laid out when it took over in February, that there would be a gradual process toward resumption of normalcy and a return to elections within a 1-year time frame. So I think the idea of the envoy is to serve as a bridge and also as a person who would monitor the progress and keep the junta as accountable as possible. The other interesting outcome that came out of the April meeting is that we did see a group of countries within ASEAN that were taking a more vocal and active lead. This includes Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. So of the 9, these 4 countries were effectively seen as taking a more active charge in raising their concerns and frustrations more visibly. Of course, individually, ASEAN, these 4 countries have raised their own grievances. Singapore, for instance, has come out very publicly condemning the bloodshed and calling it disastrous and very unfortunate. And there's also been comments from the Indonesian foreign minister that there needs to be more accountability and more progress in terms of getting that envoy, letting that envoy sort of enter Myanmar and take up the responsibility that the envoy was supposed to do based on the April agreement. In May, there was an interesting development in which the ASEAN 9 came out collectively in unison, condemning and not supporting a General Assembly resolution in the United Nations that was going to impose arms embargo in Myanmar. There are a variety of reasons that were happening behind the scenes of why they collectively took this approach. obviously a disappointment to many in the international community. The rationale that I've heard from colleagues who understand that decision-making process for the Collective 9 to take that position is that they really wanted to get that process going in terms of having the ASEAN Secretary General and the ASEAN envoy to be on the ground, to hit the ground running as soon as possible. And so any efforts that could impede that process obviously was not going to be helpful and conducive in ASEAN leaders' views. And so they came out in unison against that resolution. And just recently, most recently in June this month, we saw that in sidelines of a China-ASEAN foreign ministers meeting, we did see some key members again of the four that were most vocal and active on this issue, primarily Indonesia and Singapore, the foreign ministers, again, voicing and expressing their frustration and the call to deploy the envoy as soon as possible. So those are some of the key events that have happened. And I'll turn now a little bit to sort of examining sort of why ASEAN has taken this approach. We all know that there's no shortage of frustration when it comes to ASEAN in dealing with regional crises, especially security ones. And this is without an exception, another sort of point in which is a test for ASEAN whether or not it can rally around and step up to the plate to meet the challenge that's emerging. I tend to see that ASEAN is an evolving and developing security community, right? It is not a collective security. It is not a collective defense pact. It is not a security regime. It is a security community that's evolving. And the key distinction difference there is that a security community is one that's premised fundamentally on a shared understanding of a couple of things. And for ASEAN, it really is about the peaceful settlement of disputes, non-use of force, non-sort of excessive use of intervention in internal affairs. And it is through the premises on formal and informal dialogue processes that would get toward conflict avoidance or conflict resolution. Of course, fundamental to any sort of community, security community is this collective identity. And I think for ASEAN, it's been an uneasy road over 50 plus years of finding what that identity and collective voice is. Obviously, when you have an association with 10 very disparate members at varying levels of economic development and progress, you're going to get this kind of more of a cacophony than a sort of a unified voice at every issue at every turn. But I think there is this fundamental understanding. The group is grounded on a fundamental principle that they don't regard the use of force as a mode of conflict resolution amongst themselves. And I think that's important to understand. And so any language that would smell of regime change, that would assert a very strong interventionist force, is going to probably get a much more difficult or challenging sort of unified response from all ASEAN 10. There may be members within the ASEAN 10 that would like to meet that challenge with a greater sort of response beyond the diplomatic realm. But I think at a minimum, there is this common understanding of what the security community is about. It is not about, coercion, deterrence. It is not about resolving conflict through threats and sanctions and things of that nature to resolve disputes. It is about this sort of formal, informal dialogue of both incorporating the sort of the social legal kind of aspects of how institutions work with a treaty and all that, but also through the informal socialization processes that happen on the sidelines of these meetings. So I think those are some of the key fundamental drivers of explaining why ASEAN took the approach that it takes in the Myanmar crisis. But I will sort of close with somewhat of a cautiously optimistic view, and that is ASEAN has always viewed Myanmar as an interesting case because it's gone through quite a bit. It's not a mature democracy, and none of the ASEAN 10 really meet that criteria of a full-fledged democracy. And so it is difficult for the finger-pointing approach to take place because they are cognizant of the inherent weaknesses that each of the countries face in the region domestically. And so for ASEAN, I think it's always sort of constantly finding and searching what is the common ground and what can it do to ensure that it meets the greatest degree of success, pragmatically speaking. And so the regime, the junta, as much as it is a problem, it is also very much part of the solution going forward. And that's always been ASEAN's stand. When Aung San Suu Kyi reemerged as Myanmar's leader and her party won the last election, it was very clear that they had hopes that this would continue the process of democratization, but they also knew that any sort of normalcy was going to require the junta's, the military's involvement, which is front and center in Myanmar politics. And so I think that the ASEAN approach and the way ASEAN saw the Myanmar crisis is that rather than shunning and closing off all doors to the junta, they wanted to leave that door open, in which the junta is very much part of the process. And that was front and center in the logic of having the Myanmar junta leader present at that April summit. It was important for him to hear the views of the ASEAN 9, but also for them to hear what he has laid out in terms of the next 10 months, in terms of returning the country to elections. So, the closing statement or closing remark that I would leave with the group is that, so even in consequential security crises and issues that involve sovereignty, which is a touchy, sensitive topic for all ASEAN members, ASEAN states, like all other states in the international community, really are constantly modifying and contesting and redefining the concept of sovereignty and the concept of intervention to themselves, as well as in relationship with their peers in and outside a region. So that gives me some degree of cautious optimism going forward. Thank you.
Chen, thank you very much. That was an excellent primer on current events and current status. Of course, ASEAN has many critics. I think there are more people who are cautiously pessimistic than cautiously optimistic right now. It's also worth noting that this is not the first time that ASEAN has failed to reach our already, I think, low expectations of them. I think many will recall, and I know Bob will touch on this in his own remarks, that in 2002, the Southeast Asian states met with China to have a declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea with a code of conduct to, quote, immediately follow. 19 years later, we're still waiting for that code of conduct to appear. And the few rumors and reported drafts that we've seen have added more concerns than they have optimism to the debate. And there's also been, I think, the real concern, it's been expressed by some of the officials or retired officials in Singapore, among others, of at least two of the ASEAN members, in effect, becoming China's client states. And as a result, even talked that they should be expelled from ASEAN. So Myanmar, in the broader context, I think is just another in a series of challenges. Bob, why don't I turn it over to you to give us your views? Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Our seminar, our panel is to look at ASEAN Challenged. And so my part of it was to look at the ASEAN's relations relevance in the South China Sea issues, and to see the challenge for ASEAN in that context as well. It's related to Myanmar in the sense of looking at the possibility of U.S. and ASEAN actions in the Myanmar situation. But I'm going to focus on the South China Sea. And I like this opportunity. I'm very glad to have it, to work with Chin and with Catherine and Ralph on this. And Rob, I really appreciate this opportunity. Because it allows you to reflect on what's happened over the last 10 years. And that's what I'm going to do, just to reflect on that. I have 4 points to make about ASEAN, and I have 3 points to make about China, and I'm going to make a couple of points about the United States and the implications with this review. And what does the review show? The record of ASEAN's relevance to the South China Sea. It shows ASEAN as weak and irresolute. And And of course, the US has been weak and irresolute. It was under the Obama government. So that compounded this kind of a situation in dealing with the South China Sea disputes. Now, the US became much harder toward China under the Trump administration, but that didn't necessarily appeal to ASEAN. ASEAN countries and ASEAN itself tended to view this kind of approach as dangerous for their interests. And they tended to be more critical of the United States in various ways, even though they were pretty reticent about Beijing. We found that, of course, the Chinese had managed, as we just discussed, managed to win over Cambodia by 2012 and make ASEAN quiet about the South China Sea disputes, not talk about various aspects of it that were sensitive to China. And they just stopped doing that. And they didn't really stand against China in any sort of public way, even when China was intruding on their territory. They tended to avoid this kind of discussion in public, at least. But ASEAN still remains important as a convener for the various groups that deal with these issues, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the Defense Ministers Plus, and the East Asian Summit, of course, is very important in dealing with South China Sea issues. And here we find it's mainly the non-ASEAN countries that speak up in these kinds of fora in ways that would be seen as sensitive to China. So we find there's a record of deference to China that you see in this 10-year period on the part of the ASEAN countries. And so what does this all mean? I mean, it's for now, I mean, okay, so the ASEANs obviously didn't like the harsh rhetoric of the Trump administration and their abrupt, changeable approach. Mr. Biden has a very different type of approach. He is focused on China for sure. But he wants to work with allies and partners, building up a position of strength, as he says all the time, in order to deal with China. This is something that when the Biden people look at ASEAN, what do they see? Do they see actors that are prepared to help them, to work with them in this regard? And I think this is something that ASEAN should think about if they want to have a better relationship with the United States. And the Biden administration surely is thinking about this too. But the upshot is that they're not doing much with ASEAN, and there's a lot of criticism in the region because ASEAN, United States, is not paying much attention to ASEAN. Well, maybe ASEAN doesn't help the United States in doing what it wants to do, and it's pretty clear what they want to do, both in Asia and in Europe. They're trying to build up support, not to be confrontational, but to build up support to deal with China and the infractions and challenges of China. From a position of greater strength. And so this is a real dilemma, I think, for going forward. And will ASEAN want to do this? And will the Biden administration find other ways to work with ASEAN that will not necessarily be in line with the main theme of what they're emphasizing in international affairs? Now, let's look at it briefly from the China's perspective. This is an area of great success. The Chinese have done very well here. They've quieted ASEAN's resistance to them. They have allies and partners in ASEAN that prevent unanimity on just about anything that's significant that China doesn't want them to talk about. This is part of Xi Jinping's China dream. And while his China dream has run up against real problems with Japan and with India and so forth, but here they've had pretty smooth sailing. I don't want to say smooth sailing, but they've made a lot of progress in advancing their interests. And they're to the point now, as Ralph alluded, that the code of conduct, which used to be thought of as something that possibly could constrain Chinese advances at the expense of others in the South China Sea, the Chinese may control that outcome of the code of conduct. And then we have the Belt and Road Initiative, which has compounded the attractiveness of China, made it much more attractive in a lot of ways. And so China is increasingly seen as the overwhelming power in the region. And then it's the authoritarian governments, and there are lots of them in ASEAN. They're attracted to China, and they can get the assistance and economic financing power and so forth they need without having to go through international organizations that require reforms. And so they're very much like that. And it allows for corruption. And so this is the BRI problem. The Belt and Road Initiative projects have a lot of corruption in them. And Malaysia liked this for a while, and the Myanmar military liked it for a while. And Hun Sen seems to like it. And so these kinds of things are attractive, and these are not going to be able to come from Western aligned countries. And it involves major infrastructure. And so when this major infrastructure gets built, then these countries become very dependent on China to maintain them, and very hard to replace. And so this is a real advantage for China. And all of these things are big benefits. Now, I mentioned that U.S. policy was not very resolute in the Obama government in dealing with the situation in the South China Sea, and that it's changed. But as I also mentioned, just to repeat my point here, that ASEAN did not approve of Mr. Trump's approach. Not his approach, his administration's approach. Mr. Trump's approach was erratic, but his administration had a fairly consistent approach, and this was something that was too harsh for the governments of ASEAN, understandably so. But Biden has come in. He's not harsh. He's very systematic in his approach. He's very steady in how he goes about things. But even here, there's a lot of understandable, perhaps, reluctance to get too close to the United States on this one. Will the United States last? Will this approach that Mr. Biden has, which they tend to like, multilateral approach, listening, this kind of consultative approach, will this last? And I think people in ASEAN have seen enough in the United States to say, maybe the U.S. isn't that stable, and maybe we'll have Trump come back. This kind of thinking is prevalent, and therefore will act as a brake for doing things dramatically to work on the U.S. side to help them against China. It will be something that they would avoid because China will punish them, and because the benefit coming from the United States may not last very long. And so the U.S. inability to use ASEAN as any sort of a wedge against China is, I think, pretty obvious, it seems to me. And so what you find, I mentioned, the code of conduct seems to be under Chinese influence a lot, those talks. And then allies like Thailand and the Philippines, these are not really close allies in so many ways. I mean, I think things could change in the Philippines with a new president, but Thailand is going its own way. And so this is not a strong alliance relationship. Vietnam is a country that seems to have a very strong position about China, and they do. But are they willing to work with the United States at this juncture? And you look at the record, what they're doing now and what they did 10 years ago are very different. And they're much more cautious in dealing with this kind of situation. Malaysia and Indonesia are very careful to avoid taking sides. And Singapore, while very integrated militarily with the United States, doesn't want to choose in this kind of a situation. And so when you come down to it, what will the U.S. do about the South China Sea? Well, it may do a lot of things. I think it will. It is doing a lot of things, but it will use the Quad. It will use other powers. It will use the British and the French, these kinds of things. The NATO. I'm anxious to see what NATO has to say about the South China Sea in this latest meeting with Biden. And so, but ASEAN, well, maybe not much. And so under these circumstances, then what do you see the U.S. doing in Myanmar? You see a very limited, sort of a traditional approach. They're just using human rights issues, and they're not really taking a big role, and they're supporting ASEAN's leadership. But are they taking significant moves in this regard and to coordinate with ASEAN? I don't know. They may be doing things quietly. But the idea that you're going to get something that'll be very meaningful from this process, I think, is questionable. And the South China Sea experience of the last 10 years underlines why some Americans would look at this and say, yeah, this is pretty questionable, that they're going to actually take strong positions, particularly in ways that would be directed at China in some way, or be seen as directed in China. So I'm sorry to be a little pessimistic about this, but that's what the review shows over the last 10 years. And it's really been fun working this issue with Chin over in this period of time. And I've learned a lot, and it's nice to have this opportunity to reflect on it. Thank you very much.
Bob, thank you very much. Excellent summary. I think it's fair to say that it's easier to be cautiously optimistic if you're Chinese than if you're Americans right now. And things seem to be certainly moving more in China's direction. I think it's also fair to say that there was, I think, an opportunity. This administration coming in was much more inclined to support multilateral cooperation. And even the first summit of the Quad went out of its way to talk about ASEAN centrality. But it's very difficult to imagine an East Asia summit meeting in person that would put Senior General Min Aung Hlaing in the same room with Joe Biden. So I think this, again, is going to be a self-inflicted wound that's going to make it very hard. Catherine, how cautiously optimistic or pessimistic are you? Please take the floor.
I am incautiously pessimistic. Thank you for that. And thank you for the lead in also on ASEAN centrality. This is a little bit some things that Bob also brought up, but let me start with the issue of ASEAN centrality, because I think oftentimes when we hear this being discussed, it sounds as though it is a permanent framework. And I tend to see it more, less as a static feature of the region and more as an instrument that occasionally works and sometimes is not applicable. And let me just start off by pointing to a couple of cases in the past where I think ASEAN centrality has been quite important. And one was the early days of trying to resolve the Cambodian Civil War, by which I mean the mid to late 1980s, really before the UN process kicked in, when you did have an ASEAN process where you had Thailand as the frontline state responsible perhaps for liaison with Cambodia, you had Indonesia being liaison to Vietnam, and you had a sort of ASEAN tag team that I think very effectively delivered to the international community, to the region, and to the three countries of Indochina, a slight movement that allowed then a further opening. I think that is oftentimes underrated in the history of the resolution of the Cambodian conflict. Less dramatically, but I think equally important, is that ASEAN served as what I would call the training wheels. If any of you learn to ride a bike, you know exactly what I mean. Through the ASEAN +3 process, in which ASEAN, through its systems and through its mechanisms, really helped and encouraged the countries of Northeast Asia to be able to interface with one another again. But this is not the ASEAN of 1967. This is not the ASEAN of 1989 or 1995 or 2005. This is 2021, obviously, and you have, first of all, a fair amount of normalization in the region, and you also have a very different ASEAN, much broader, more integrated, with more political divisions, more socio and economic divisions, and that sort of thing. So the question then would be, is the current crisis in Myanmar going to respond to ASEAN centrality? And I'm going to say up to a very limited degree. But before we get there, I also want to talk about another theme that we oftentimes hear in conferences such as this, which is Southeast Asian objections to what they call strategic competition. And here, this is another sort of time warp. If you look at the fact that in 2021, the three largest economies in the world are in the Asia-Pacific region: United States, China, and Japan. The five largest militaries in the world are in the Indo-Pacific region: China, India, United States, North Korea, and Russia. And so my point is that regional powers in Asia are also global powers. And you're going to see an increasing global calculation in great power behavior in the region. And so to try and keep it at the regional level and say that you can't have strategic competition, I think is a bit unrealistic. That said, as Chin pointed out, and as Bob pointed out, the United States presently supports ASEAN's position towards Myanmar, in part because ASEAN has become sort of the de facto external actor. But why would that be? And let me just underscore that I think that there's very little hope in the very near term for a resolution of this crisis, because it does seem that Min Aung Hlaing is going to postpone any genuine dialogue until he has locked in and consolidated his power. And then he will, when things have quote unquote stabilized, he might move to a dialogue. But one of the reasons, besides the fact that ASEAN is probably the most acceptable external actor to Myanmar, or at least to the junta, is that the Myanmar crisis is also a crisis in and for ASEAN as well, in part because Myanmar is a member state of ASEAN. And so ASEAN is more motivated in many ways to try and find a solution. And just as an example of why this is a crisis, obviously the kinds of economic integration goals that ASEAN aspires to through the economic blueprint are not going to continue if you have a country that is tanking economically as Myanmar presently is. It is, of course, going to impede the restart of the ASEAN cycle of internal and external meetings. The ASEAN summit this spring was postponed until the fall, in part, I'm sure, because of the Myanmar crisis. Obviously, the East Asia summit will be awkward. I tend to disagree with Ralph that President Biden won't sit in a room with Min Aung Hlaing. I'm not sure he wouldn't do that, but it's certainly what it will do is it will make every one of those meetings a referendum on Myanmar. And that's really not to ASEAN's benefit. It also has exacerbated divisions within ASEAN and will continue to do so. And it has also, of course, given ASEAN something it does not want, which is the prospect of the return of sanctions to Southeast Asia and pressure on other ASEAN states to support sanctions that the United States, the European Union, and the UK and Australia, New Zealand are imposing. So, like it or not, ASEAN has this de facto role. Let me also say that there are issues with leadership in this that are going to affect everyone, but also are problematic for both ASEAN and the United States. One is that we don't really know who is negotiating on the civilian side. If you read the Financial Times this morning, there was a startling article in which Aung San Suu Kyi's lawyer is quoted as saying that basically she's largely unaware of what has oftentimes been happening since the February coup, because the military have been pretty effective in terms of keeping her incommunicado. She's going on to trial, as everybody knows. So who then is the leader? This comes up in issues such as the statement made by the National Unity government that presumably, if they regain power, Rohingya will get citizenship and the 1 million refugees in Bangladesh will be returned peacefully. This is very interesting to the United States, which views the NLD, for example, as having a somewhat checkered history recently on the Rohingya. So who exactly is making this decision and who would back this decision up is not something that is immediately clear. And is this actually something that they are determined to do, or is this something that would be given away when the horse trading starts between the military and the civilian government? The second is the very difficult issue, and it's almost inescapable, that if you are going to deal with Min Aung Hlaing and the junta, that there is some de facto recognition in that, and that's inescapable. But for the present time, the other side is not available for the most part, if he is going to participate, or so it seems. But there are also interesting issues of who exactly is leading ASEAN on this. And Shin was talking about Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia on the one hand. Thailand obviously also has some bona fides in this. Thailand also has some discomfort in this, not least being that Prime Minister Prayut himself came to power as a junta leader. He has been rather reticent publicly on this. He probably would rather not be identified with it. But these are all things that are going to have to be worked out before you can have any kind of a meaningful dialogue, which I think is pretty far away. But why does the United States do it? The United States does not have the kind of leverage on Myanmar that would make it an immediate interlocutor, an immediate external power that could influence the situation, in my opinion. Prior to the coup, the United States was Myanmar's 84th largest trading partner. I'm sure it has slipped since then, 84th. After ASEAN, probably the best external actors who might be able to influence both sides would be India, Japan, and China. But I'm not even sure it's ready for that yet. This is sort of almost by default. Also, the United States has, I think, taken a principled stand on sanctions. They are determined to keep them targeted on the military, keep economic pressure on the military. It's not clear, first of all, if they're going to be able to continue to do that, if the situation continues to deteriorate. And it's also not clear, as they seek to put an economic vice on the military, if they can avoid broad sanctions, given the military's very profound involvement in Myanmar economy, particularly in sectors like the banking sector. So this is, I think, one of the reasons that ASEAN wanted to put itself forward, in fact, was to try and limit the sanctions that the United States and possibly the EU and the UK will be putting on there. Let me finish with a caution. Because just as this is no longer the same strategic environment it was before, just as much as ASEAN is no longer the same group, this is not the same Myanmar either. And I think that one of the things that has been heartening, also somewhat startling, is the degree of pushback that this coup has gotten from the opposition, from society, from the public. Now, there are some red flags in that. The self-defense force, some of the conflict training and things like that probably are going to be very hard for the United States and the West to support. But my point is that when there is a meaningful dialogue process, I'm not sure that the public is going to stand for it to be only between Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing. And what is this broader group going to be? I mean, the National Unity Government is a broad coalition. The role of the ethnic parties is undefined, but clearly they are going to have a vote. And so it really behooves all of us to take a fresh look at that as well. It's hard to know now until something shakes loose how it is that you can craft a policy to include this new sort of force in Myanmar. But that is something I think that is also new, that also needs to be looked at very seriously by external actors as well as those in the region. So I'll stop there, Ralph.
Good, Catherine, thank you very much. And